Welcome to the Twisted Case Files. Here, mysteries unravel, secrets linger, and the supernatural awaits discovery. Dive deep into eerie tales, chilling encounters, and the dark unknown. The case is open. Are you ready to uncover the truth? The wind had a way of clawing through the trees in Ravenmoor, slipping through the cracks in old buildings and dragging whispers along with it. That night, as Victor and I approached the edge of the town, I swear I could hear its quiet laughter, mocking the audacity of our arrival. The lantern in my hand struggled against the restless air, its warm glow flickering as if hesitant to venture any farther. Victor, as always, walked ahead, a silhouette against the faint orange glow of the street lamps that barely held their own against the encroaching mist. Ravenmoor wasn't a welcoming place, not by any stretch of imagination. Houses leaned on each other as if the years had worn them thin, their roofs bent and splintered, their windows nothing more than darkened eyes staring down the streets. There were no voices, no lights to mark where families might linger inside, just the soft hum of the wind brushing against cracked shutters. Victor paused at the town center, his gaze fixed on the massive structure ahead, the asylum. It stood like a grotesque monument to forgotten sins, its walls cracked and burdened with the weight of 1,000 untold stories. The mist curled around its edges like fingers beckoning us closer. I stepped beside Victor, taking in the sight. Something about it clawed at my stomach, a visceral unease that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. Victor's voice broke the silence. "Lights," he said simply. "Midnight." I nodded, clearing my throat to push past the lump forming there. "And the sounds?" His eyes met mine briefly, before returning to the asylum's eerie silhouette. "We'll find out." That was Victor for you. He wasn't one for speculation, nor for delving into fear. He operated with precision, with cold detachment, as if nothing in the world could unsettle him. I envied that, especially now. We moved through the town in silence, our footsteps swallowed by the oppressive stillness that surrounded us. Occasionally, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, a curtain shifting here, a shadow darting there, but I dismissed them as tricks of the light, unwilling to entertain the thought of anything worse. The wind carried on, its whispers growing louder the closer we got to the asylum gates. Victor pushed them open without hesitation. The iron groaned under his touch, the sound stretching through the mist like a warning. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder at the town behind us, then followed him through the gates. The grounds were overrun with weeds, their roots digging deep into the cracked stone pathways that led to the asylum's entrance. Vines crept along the walls, their fingers trailing over the broken windows as if searching for a way inside. The air was colder here, sharper, and carried a faint metallic tang that unsettled me further. Victor stopped at the front doors. He turned his head slightly, just enough to confirm that I was still beside him. "Ready?" I almost laughed. "As ready as I'll ever be." The doors creaked open, their hinges protesting against the intrusion. We stepped inside, and the darkness consumed us almost immediately. The lantern's flame flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space ahead. The hallway stretched forward into endless shadow, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and empty frames. Furniture lay scattered across the floor, desks overturned, chairs broken, papers strewn about like the remnants of a hurricane. Victor moved forward with the kind of confidence I wished I could summon. His steps echoed faintly against the tiles, though the sound was quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence that filled the space. I followed closely, keeping the lantern raised, though its light did little to push back the shadows pressing in from all sides. "Here," Victor said, stopping near the remains of what must have been a reception desk. He crouched, his gloved hands running over the wood. Symbols. I stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. The carvings were crude, their edges jagged and uneven, as if made in haste. They formed strange patterns that seemed almost deliberate, though I couldn't make sense of them. Victor's finger traced one symbol, his touch light but steady. A language? I asked. He didn't answer, not immediately. His gaze shifted to the corner of the desk, where a faint smear of dried blood marked the surface. Markers, he muttered. Intentional. Warnings? I suggested, though my voice faltered as I spoke. The asylum carried a heavy sense of foreboding, one that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Victor stood, brushing off his gloves before continuing down the hallway. I followed, my gaze darting between the shadows, searching for any sign of the spectral lights we'd been told about. The building seemed to hum around us, its very walls breathing with the weight of its secrets. Occasionally, I thought I caught the faintest sound, a whisper, a laugh, but it was gone just as quickly as it came, leaving behind only the stillness. Victor's movements grew slower as we reached the next corridor, his attention fixed on the windows lining the walls. There, he said, pointing toward one of the panes. I squinted, leaning forward, and then I saw it, the faint flicker of light in the distance. It was subtle, just enough to catch my eye, but unmistakable nonetheless. As we approached the source, the flicker grew stronger, brighter, until it cast strange, elongated shadows against the walls. I froze, the lantern trembling in my grasp. The light seemed almost alive, its movements erratic and unnatural, as if it were trying to communicate something beyond my understanding. Victor stepped forward without hesitation, his notebook already in hand. Electromagnetic, he muttered. No natural source. No logical source, I countered, though my voice was barely a whisper. This isn't. Victor silenced me with a glance. He gestured toward the far corner of the room, where the light flickered strongest. And then I saw them, figures. Shifting, restless, their shapes barely perceptible yet undeniably human. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if trapped in some endless loop. I stumbled backward, the edge of the doorframe catching me as I struggled to keep my balance. Victor! I see them, he interrupted, his voice calm but sharp. He stepped closer to the figures, his gaze fixed on their movements. Trapped! The figures seemed to react to his presence, their shadows twisting and writhing like living things. Their whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed a cacophony that made my pulse hammer against my ribs. Help, release, justice. Victor turned back to me, his expression unreadable. Lucien, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. Write this down. I fumbled for my notebook, scribbling the words as quickly as I could, though my hands trembled with every stroke. The whispers grew louder still, their words slicing through the air with chilling precision. I wanted to move, to leave, to escape the suffocating presence of the figures, but my feet were rooted to the floor, my breath caught in my throat. Victor stepped closer to the figures, his movement slow but deliberate. They're waiting, he muttered. For something. For what? I asked, though the question felt absurd even as I spoke it. He didn't answer, not immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the figures, his notebook clutched tightly in his hand. Finally, he turned to me, his voice steady but low. The question that brought them here. The whispers began as soon as the spectral lights flickered out, leaving us in darkness so complete it felt as though we had been swallowed whole. They came from every direction, slipping through the walls, coiling in the air around us, and pressing cold, invisible fingers against the base of my spine. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly, lantern trembling in my grasp. The warm glow of its flame was an insult to the cold reality of where we stood. Victor remained unnervingly still, his silhouette carved sharply against the oppressive shadows. Even in the suffocating quiet, his composure never wavered, a steady anchor in the storm of the unknown. He raised a gloved hand, signaling for me to hold my position. I obliged, though every nerve in my body screamed to move, to run, to escape whatever unseen eyes I felt boring into me. "There's movement," Victor murmured, tilting his head toward the far end of the hallway. His voice was steady, focused, like a blade honed to razor sharpness. "Do you see it?" I squinted into the abyss, the feeble light of the lantern stretching out in vain. At first, I saw nothing but the jagged edges of broken furniture and the peeling remnants of wallpaper. But then, just at the edge of my vision, something shifted. It wasn't a figure, not exactly, more like a distortion in the air, a ripple in the fabric of reality itself. It moved deliberately, gliding through the darkness with an unnatural grace that set my teeth on edge. "I see it," I whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Victor's hand went to the pocket of his coat, retrieving the small notebook he always carried. He flipped it open with practiced precision, the pages whispering as he turned to an empty one. "Describe it," he said, his pencil poised and ready. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus. "It's shifting. Like smoke, but denser. It doesn't hold a solid shape, but it feels," I hesitated, the weight of the words threatening to choke me. "It feels deliberate. Like it knows we're here." Victor's pencil scratched against the page, the sound grounding me just enough to keep my head above water. He nodded once, then returned the notebook to his pocket. "Stay close," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. We moved cautiously, the air growing heavier with each step. The whispers seemed to follow us, ebbing and flowing like the tide, their unintelligible words brushing against my ears in a language I couldn't hope to understand. The distortion lingered ahead, always just out of reach, its movement slow and measured, as though it were leading us somewhere. The hallway opened into what must have once been a common room, though time and neglect had reduced it to little more than a husk of its former self. Broken chairs and tables littered the space, their splinters scattered across the floor like the remnants of a shattered memory. The windows were barred, their glass long since replaced by jagged shards that caught the faintest glimmers of moonlight. The distortion halted at the center of the room, hovering above the remains of what appeared to be a wheelchair. The whispers grew louder, their cadence shifting, their pitch rising in a way that made my skin crawl. I tightened my grip on the lantern, its glow barely enough to illuminate the scene before us. Victor stepped forward, his movements careful but unhesitating. He crouched beside the wheeled chair, his keen eye scanning every inch of it. "Blood," he muttered, pointing to a dark stain that had seeped into the fabric of the seat. "Old, but significant." I stayed a few steps behind, unwilling to stray too far from the relative safety of the doorway. "Do you think it's connected to the lights?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Perhaps," he replied, his tone contemplative. "But there's more to this. The whispers, they're not random." I wanted to ask what he meant, but the words caught in my throat. The whispers were louder now, a symphony of voices layered upon one another, each one distinct yet impossible to isolate. They weren't speaking to us, not directly, but their presence was undeniable. It was as though they were trapped, their words circling endlessly, searching for a way out. Victor reached into his coat again, this time retrieving a small vial filled with a clear liquid. He uncorked it carefully, pouring a few drops onto the stained fabric of the wheelchair. The reaction was immediate. The whispers surged, their intensity doubling as the room seemed to darken further. The distortion above the wheelchair writhed, its form twisting violently before retreating to the far corner of the room. "What did you do?" I demanded, my voice trembling. Victor stood, slipping the vial back into his pocket. "An old trick," he said, his gaze fixed on the corner where the distortion now lingered. "Salt water mixed with a binding agent. It reacts to residual energy." Residual energy. The term hung heavy in the air, carrying with it implications I wasn't ready to face. Before I could press further, Victor moved toward the corner, his steps deliberate and unyielding. The distortion shifted again, its movements frantic now, as though it were trying to escape. "Wait," I called after him, my voice louder than I intended. "We don't even know what it is." He paused, glancing back at me with an expression that bordered on amusement. "That's why we're here, Lucien. To find out." The words offered little comfort, but I forced myself to follow him, the lantern's glow casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As we approached the corner, the distortion seemed to shrink, its form condensing into something more tangible. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Victor crouched again, examining the space where the distortion had been. The floorboards were warped, their edges splintered, and a faint scorch mark marred the wood. He ran his fingers over the mark, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't recent," he said. "Whatever caused it happened years ago." I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest easing just slightly. "So what now?" Victor straightened, his gaze sweeping the room. "We keep moving," he said simply. The words were both a command and a promise, and though every fiber of my being wanted to protest, I found myself nodding. Together, we stepped back into the hallway, the whispers fading behind us as we ventured deeper into the heart of the asylum. The asylum's air grew heavier the farther we ventured, pressing down with a weight that seemed to seep into my very bones. Each step echoed like a hesitant heartbeat, amplifying the silence that stretched taut around us. The corridor ahead appeared endless, its faded walls coated with grime and neglect, yet beneath the decay, I could make out faint traces of old murals, paintings of serene landscapes and smiling faces meant to comfort the souls once confined here. Now, they were ghostly remnants, their colors faded into oblivion. Victor strode ahead, unwavering, his lantern casting flickering shadows that danced and distorted across the walls. I followed close behind, the warmth of the flame failing to chase away the chill creeping up my spine. His focus was razor-sharp, his attention shifting between the hall itself and the cryptic notes in his pocket notebook. Occasionally, he would mutter under his breath, words too soft to catch, yet laden with purpose. A sudden sound broke the oppressive quiet, a soft creak, like old wood shifting under unseen weight. I froze, gripping my lantern tightly as my breath caught in my throat. The noise echoed once more, closer this time, accompanied by the faint rustle of fabric, a presence moving just out of sight. Victor paused as well, his head tilting slightly, his sharp gaze narrowing on the farthest edge of the hallway. "We're not alone," I whispered, my voice trembling against the shadows. Victor gave the barest nod, his expression calm, his movements deliberate as he reached into his coat and retrieved a small, worn object. At first, I thought it was his notebook again, but I recognized the carved details of his pocket compass, a tool he used not for navigation, but for sensing disruptions in electromagnetic fields. The needle spun wildly as he held it aloft, oscillating in erratic patterns that seemed to echo the unease brewing in the air. "This is residual," Victor murmured, almost to himself. "A lingering presence." "Lingering doesn't mean harmless," I shot back, my eyes darting toward the corners of the corridor. Shadows seemed thicker there, unwilling to yield even to the light of the lantern. Every nerve in my body screamed caution, but Victor's stride never faltered. He pressed onward, his movements pulling me along like an anchor. The hallway opened into a larger room, a space that might have been a recreation area decades ago. Now, it was littered with the decaying remains of furniture, overturned chairs, splintered tables, and a piano sitting crookedly in the corner, its keys yellowed and warped. The smell here was different, sharper, like mildew and rust, mingling with something deeper, a scent I couldn't quite place, but instinctively feared. Victor's gaze immediately shifted to the walls. Unlike the rest of the asylum, their surfaces weren't entirely bare. Strange symbols were etched into the paint, their patterns sprawling in jagged spirals that stretched across the room. Some of the markings were faint, barely visible beneath layers of grime, while others were fresh, their lines stark and deliberate. "Ritual markings," Victor muttered, moving closer to one of the symbols. His voice was calm, his tone measured, yet there was an edge to it, a tension buried beneath the surface. "Sacred geometry. Intentional placement." I followed him cautiously, my lantern casting uneven light over the markings. "Do you think it's connected to the experiments?" Victor didn't answer immediately. His fingers traced the edges of the symbols, his movements methodical, his expression sharp with concentration. "Perhaps," he said finally. "Or perhaps the experiments invited something else." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. I turned away from the markings, my attention shifting to the piano in the corner. The instrument was grotesque in its decay, yet something about it drew me closer. The air around it felt thicker, charged, as though it held some unseen significance. "Victor," I called softly, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "Over here." He glanced up, his gaze following mine to the piano. He joined me quickly, his lantern raising to illuminate the instrument in full. The keys were warped beyond recognition, their surfaces splintered and stained. What struck me most, however, was the object resting atop the piano, a small glass jar, its surface cloudy with age, its contents obscured by the thick residue clinging to its interior. Victor's eyes narrowed as he reached for the jar. His gloves creaked faintly as he gripped the object, turning it carefully in his hands. "An artifact," he murmured. "Likely a remnant of the experiments." "What's inside?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Victor shook the jar gently, the residue shifting within. A faint sound emerged, a soft, hollow clink, like glass striking bone. "Fragments," he said. "Organic matter." My stomach churned, and I instinctively stepped back. Victor's expression didn't change, his focus was entirely on the jar. He moved to pocket it, but before he could, the piano emitted a sudden, jarring sound, a single note, loud and broken, echoing through the room like the scream of something long forgotten. I stumbled backward, the lantern flickering wildly in my grasp. Victor remained rooted in place, his head snapping toward the piano, his sharp gaze narrowing on its warped frame. "Residual energy," he muttered, his voice clipped, but calm. "No," I stammered, the sound reverberating in my ears. "That wasn't, it couldn't." Victor turned to me, his tone low and steady. "Focus, Lucien. Fear will distort your perception." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe, to steady the trembling in my hands. The piano remained silent now, its twisted frame looming like a spectre in the corner. Victor set the jar gently atop a nearby table and retrieved his compass once more, holding it above the instrument. The needle spun violently, faster than I had seen before, its movements almost frantic. "This room holds significance," Victor said, his gaze shifting to the symbols etched into the walls. "A nexus point for residual energy. Likely tied to the experiments." I wanted to argue, to demand we leave this cursed place behind, but Victor's focus was unrelenting, his movements calculated as he began sketching the symbols in his notebook. I stood frozen, my lantern casting flickering shadows across the room, the oppressive air pressing heavily against my chest. Then, from somewhere beyond the walls, the whispers returned. They were louder now, their cadence shifting, their words overlapping in a symphony of anguish. I tightened my grip on the lantern, my pulse hammering in my ears. Victor raised his head, his sharp gaze narrowing toward the farthest corner of the room. "They're moving," he muttered, his tone tense but steady. "We're close." "Close to what?" I demanded, the words escaping me in a trembled breath. Victor didn't answer, not immediately. He pocketed his notebook, his gaze sweeping the room once more. "Prepare yourself," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for protest. "The asylum won't give up its secrets easily." The atmosphere in the asylum seemed to shift with every step Victor and I took. It was as if the building itself had become aware of us, its decrepit walls groaning softly under the weight of secrets they had harbored for years. The whispers, faint but persistent, hummed low in my ears like a distant choir of anguish. Their presence felt closer now, more tangible, as though they were no longer confined to the shadows but pressing against the edges of my consciousness. Victor led the way, his lantern casting restless beams of light across the corridor. His every movement was deliberate, his attention fixed on the compass in his hand. The needle twitched erratically, its movements mirroring the unease clawing at the pit of my stomach. "The pattern shifting," Victor murmured, more to himself than to me. He stopped abruptly, tilting the compass slightly to observe the needle's dance. "It's drawing us further in." "Further into what, exactly?" I asked, my voice hushed despite the isolation. My words lingered in the stale air, unanswered. Victor didn't reply. He pocketed the compass and turned his sharp gaze to the walls around us. The faint remnants of the murals we had seen earlier had disappeared entirely, replaced by a lattice of cracks that spidered out across the plaster like skeletal fingers. His gloved hand brushed over one of the wider cracks, pausing as he frowned in contemplation. "There's something beneath," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "The walls, they're hollow in places." I stepped closer, the lantern's light spilling over his hand as he tapped against the plaster. The sound that followed was not the dull thud of solid construction, but something lighter, emptier, a cavity hidden behind the decay. A chill pricked at the back of my neck. "Hidden passages?" I ventured. "Or remnants of another time," Victor replied, his tone neutral. He pulled a penknife from his pocket and began carefully chipping away at the plaster. Each scrape of the blade sent a shiver down my spine, the sound too sharp, too vivid against the otherwise suffocating quiet. As the layers of plaster fell away, a series of strange markings began to emerge. They were etched deep into the stone beneath, their patterns intricate and unsettling. Victor tilted his head, examining them with the precision of a surgeon. "These aren't just symbols," he said after a moment. "They're instructions." "Instructions for what?" My voice cracked slightly, the question weighted with dread. Before Victor could respond, a sudden sound echoed down the corridor, a distant clang of metal against stone. I flinched, my grip tightening on the lantern as I turned toward the source of the noise. The darkness beyond our lanterns felt alive, pregnant with menace. "We're being watched," I whispered. Victor straightened, his expression sharpening as his eyes swept the hallway. "Then let them watch," he said calmly, the edge of defiance in his tone. "We're not leaving." His certainty bolstered me, if only slightly. We continued deeper into the asylum, leaving behind the etched symbols and the hollow wall. The air grew colder with every step, biting at the exposed skin of my face and hands. My breath fogged in front of me, a visible reminder of the oppressive chill that had settled over us. We entered a new room, larger than the others, its ceiling high and vaulted. The remains of rusted medical equipment were scattered throughout, their once gleaming surfaces dulled with age and corrosion. An examination table sat in the center of the room, its leather straps frayed but still intact. The sight of it made my stomach turn. Victor approached the table, his movements measured. He ran a hand over the surface, his expression unreadable. "This was a place of suffering," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The energy here is heavy." I stayed near the door, unwilling to venture closer. My eyes were drawn to a faint stain on the floor beneath the table, its edges blurred with time. Blood, I realized with a sickening certainty. The memory of whatever had occurred here was etched into the very fabric of the room. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices overlapping in a dissonant chorus. They filled the room, pressing against my ears, my chest, my very mind. I stumbled back, clutching the lantern as the light flickered wildly. "Victor!" I called out, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. "They're here!" Victor turned to me, his expression calm but focused. "Steady yourself, Lucien," he said firmly. "Fear won't help us." I tried to steady my breathing, to push back the rising tide of panic, but the whispers were relentless. They seemed to pour from the walls, the floor, the very air itself, their words unintelligible yet searing with raw emotion. Victor moved toward the far corner of the room, where the whispers seemed to converge. He crouched low, his hand brushing against something partially hidden beneath a collapsed shelf. He pulled it free, a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. "This belonged to someone here," Victor said, opening the journal carefully. The pages were brittle, their edges yellowed, but the writing within was still legible. A patient, perhaps. Or one of the staff. The whispers subsided slightly as Victor began to read aloud. The words were scrawled in a hurried, desperate hand, the ink blotched in places. They promised healing, but it was a lie. "We are experiments to them, nothing more. They take us to the lower levels, where the light cannot reach. What happens there is unspeakable. I hear the screams, even now, even in my sleep." A shudder ran through me as Victor's voice trailed off. "The lower levels," I said, my throat dry. "Do you think they're still accessible?" Victor closed the journal, his jaw set. "If they are, that's where we'll find answers." The determination in his voice left no room for argument. Despite the mounting dread, I nodded and followed him as he led the way out of the room. The whispers followed us, quieter now but no less present, their weight pressing heavily against my chest. We continued down the corridor, the air growing colder still. The walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness thickening with every step. And then, at last, we came to a stairwell, its steps descending into a black void. Victor paused, his lantern held high as he peered into the abyss. "The answers lie below," he said, his voice steady. "Are you ready, Lucien?" I wasn't. But I nodded anyway. The stairwell yawned before us, a gaping void that seemed to swallow the light of our lanterns before it could reach the bottom. Each step seemed to breathe its own warning, the damp air growing colder and heavier the farther we descended. I gripped the railing tightly, its surface slick with condensation, as Victor led the way with his characteristic composure. His lantern cast shifting shadows on the walls, their jagged shapes seeming almost alive in their restless movement. The silence between us was thick, oppressive, punctuated only by the soft creak of the wooden steps beneath our weight. I tried to focus on the sound of Victor's footsteps, a steady rhythm that kept my mind tethered to reality. Still, the whispers had not abandoned us entirely. They drifted faintly in the distance, just beyond the reach of comprehension, an ever-present reminder that we were not alone. The stairs spiraled downward, deeper than I had expected. My mind played tricks on me as I tried to gauge how far we had descended, the repetitive motion blurring my sense of time. At last, we reached the bottom, the stairs giving way to a wide, arched corridor lined with cracked tiles. The air here was different, denser, tinged with a metallic scent that lingered in my nostrils. The lantern's glow revealed patches of dark stains along the walls and floor, their edges blurred with age. Victor paused at the threshold, his sharp gaze scanning the corridor ahead. "This is where it begins," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "You mean this isn't the beginning?" He didn't answer, not directly. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements deliberate as he raised the lantern higher to illuminate our surroundings. The walls bore faint traces of writing, hastily scrawled in what looked like charcoal, or something far darker. The words were fragmented, disjointed, as though the writer's thoughts had been torn apart before they could be fully formed. Subjects, failure, light cannot reach, I read aloud, my voice barely more than a whisper. The fragmented phrases sent a shiver through me, their meaning obscured, but no less unsettling. Victor knelt beside one of the stains, his gloved fingers brushing lightly against its surface. He held them up to the lantern's glow, his expression unreadable. "Blood," he said simply. "Old, but not ancient." I turned away, the sight too much to stomach. My lantern's beam caught on something glinting faintly ahead, drawing my attention down the corridor. "Victor," I said, my voice trembling. "There's something further down." He followed my gaze, rising to his feet. Without hesitation, he pressed onward, his every step unwavering. I forced myself to follow, the lantern trembling in my grip as the glint grew brighter, more distinct. It wasn't until we were nearly upon it that I realized what it was, a doorway, its edges reinforced with rusted steel, its surface marked with deep gouges as though something had clawed at it from the inside. Victor studied the door intently, his hand resting lightly on its cold surface. "A containment room," he murmured. "Likely used during the experiments." The word sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "For what purpose?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He didn't reply. Instead, he ran his hand along the edge of the door, searching for a means to open it. His fingers brushed against a rusted lever, which groaned in protest as he pulled it downward. The door creaked open, its hinges screaming in the silence, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. The walls were lined with rusted shelves, each one filled with glass jars like the one we had found earlier. Their contents were obscured by age and residue, but their presence was unnerving all the same. At the center of the room stood a large metal table, its surface pockmarked with scratches and stains. Chains dangled from its sides, their rusted links clinking softly as the door swung fully open. Victor stepped inside, his lantern illuminating the grim tableau. His gaze shifted from the jars to the table, his expression pensive. "This was more than an experiment," he said finally. "It was a ritual." The word hung in the air like a curse. I hesitated at the doorway, the weight of the room pressing against me like a physical force. "A ritual for what?" "To push the boundaries of existence," Victor replied, his voice laced with both curiosity and unease. "To transcend mortality, perhaps. Or to control it." The implications were chilling, but before I could respond, a sudden noise shattered the stillness. It was faint at first, a distant hum, low and resonant, echoing from somewhere deep within the asylum. The sound grew steadily louder, its pitch rising until it became a bone-deep vibration that seemed to rattle the very air around us. Victor turned sharply, his attention snapping to the far end of the corridor. "It's coming from below," he said, his tone urgent. "We need to move." He stepped out of the containment room, his movements quick but controlled. I followed on instinct, my heart hammering in my chest as the humming grew louder still. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a force that seemed to fill the corridor with its oppressive weight. The walls around us began to tremble, faint cracks spidering outward from the ceiling. Dust rained down in thin streams, catching in the light of our lanterns. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath scraping against my lungs like shards of glass. "What is it?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. Victor didn't answer. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, his movements unrelenting as he led us deeper into the abyss. The corridor twisted and turned, its walls narrowing until it felt as though they were closing in around us. The humming followed us, growing louder with each step, its resonance digging into my skull like a relentless drumbeat. At last, we emerged into a vast chamber, its sheer size taking my breath away. The walls stretched high into darkness, their surfaces covered in more of the intricate symbols we had seen earlier. At the center of the room stood a massive structure, a circular platform, its surface engraved with patterns that seemed to shift and writhe under the light of our lanterns. Victor approached the platform cautiously, his gaze darting across its surface. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice filled with both awe and apprehension. "This is the epicenter." I stayed at the edge of the chamber, my grip tightening on the lantern as I watched him. The platform seemed alive, its engravings pulsating faintly as though in response to our presence. The humming reached a fever pitch, filling the chamber with its deafening resonance. "Victor," I called out, my voice trembling. "What's happening?" He turned to me, his expression grim. "We've awakened something." The chamber seemed to vibrate with its own pulse, as though it were alive, reacting to our presence. The engravings on the circular platform glimmered faintly, their shifting patterns casting eerie shadows across the massive, vaulted walls. The resonance that had followed us through the asylum was at its loudest here, a sound so deep and pervasive it seemed to burrow into my very bones. Victor stood at the edge of the platform, his sharp gaze fixed on the symbols etched into its surface. I lingered near the entrance, gripping the lantern so tightly my knuckles ached, its flickering flame trembling as though it, too, feared the darkness that surrounded us. "Victor," I managed to say, my voice strained. "What is this place?" He didn't look at me, his attention wholly consumed by the engravings. "It's a convergence," he said simply, his voice steady despite the ominous vibration in the air. "A meeting point between forces." Forces? I repeated, the word tasting foreign and heavy on my tongue. Victor crouched, brushing his gloved fingers lightly over the symbols. They seemed to ripple under his touch, their lines shifting subtly, as though alive. Residual energy, he murmured, half to himself. Sacred geometry, ritual convergence, and the anchor. I took a hesitant step closer, my every instinct screaming against it. The platform felt unnatural, its presence oppressive, its purpose incomprehensible. Yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. An anchor? I asked, my voice trembling. For what? Victor straightened, turning to face me. For whatever they summoned. The weight of his words crashed over me like a tidal wave. My mind raced, searching for answers that refused to reveal themselves. Summoned? I stammered. You mean, this wasn't just experiments? Experiments were a means to an end, Victor said grimly. But this is something beyond science. Beyond reason. They opened a door, Lucien. And something stepped through. The chamber seemed to react to his words, the resonance deepening, the vibration growing more insistent. I staggered back, my lantern's light faltering as the shadows grew darker, heavier. The engravings pulsed faintly, their lines glowing with a sickly green hue that reflected off Victor's stern features. What do we do? I asked, my voice barely audible. Victor moved to the center of the platform, his steps careful yet deliberate. He retrieved his notebook, flipping through the pages with practiced precision before settling on a blank one. We document, he said. And we prepare. Prepare for what? My question hung heavily in the air, unanswered. Victor's pen scratched against the paper, his sharp gaze darting between the glowing symbols and the notes he was rapidly transcribing. I stayed frozen near the entrance, my chest tight with fear, my pulse hammering in my ears. The resonance seemed to rise and fall in waves, its intensity shifting in tandem with the glow of the engravings. Suddenly, a new sound echoed through the chamber, a soft, rhythmic thumping, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the darkness, searching for its source. The sound was unmistakable, footsteps. Victor, I whispered urgently. Someone's here. He glanced up sharply, his eyes narrowing. They've been here all along. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but the footsteps were closer now, their cadence deliberate, unnervingly steady. The shadows seemed to shift, revealing a figure emerging from the farthest corner of the chamber. The lantern's glow barely reached them, illuminating only fragments, a silhouette, a flash of movement, a glint of something metallic. The resonance surged, the engravings on the platform glowing brighter, their sickly hue casting unsettling patterns across the chamber walls. The footsteps halted at the edge of the platform, the figure remaining just beyond the reach of the light. My grip on the lantern tightened, my breath shallow, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. "Who are you?" Victor demanded, his voice firm, unwavering. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they stepped closer, their movement slow but deliberate. As they crossed into the light, I felt my stomach drop. Their face was obscured, hidden behind a mask that resembled an amalgamation of human and animal features, a grotesque, unsettling creation that defied logic. Their clothes were tattered, hanging loosely off a gaunt frame, their hands clutching an object I couldn't identify. Victor stood his ground, his expression cold and calculating. "You were part of this," he said. "Part of the experiments." The figure tilted their head slightly, the motion disturbingly animalistic. When they spoke, Their voice was raspy, broken, as though it hadn't been used in years. "It is not an experiment," they said. "It is a promise." The word sent a chill down my spine, their meaning elusive yet undeniably sinister. Victor's gaze didn't waver, his stance unyielding despite the figure's presence. "A promise to what?" he asked. The figure raised their arms slowly, revealing the object they held, a shard of glass, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols that adorned the platform. They held it aloft, the engravings pulsating faintly as the resonance reached its apex. "To them," the figure rasped, their voice reverent, haunting. The chamber exploded with sound and light, the resonance shifting into a deafening roar as the engravings on the platform blazed to life. The vibration rattled the walls, sending streams of dust cascading from the ceiling. I stumbled backward, the lantern slipping from my grasp and shattering against the floor, its flame extinguished. Victor moved quickly, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the platform as the figure stepped onto its center. The glowing symbols twisted and writhed, their patterns forming shapes I couldn't comprehend. The resonance reached a fever pitch, drowning out all other sound, all other thought. "Lucien!" Victor shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to go." I nodded numbly, my movements clumsy as I followed him toward the entrance. The chamber seemed to collapse in on itself, the shadows growing darker, heavier, pressing against my skin like a physical force. The figure remained on the platform, their head tilted back as the glowing engravings enveloped them completely. Victor pushed me through the doorway, his grip firm as he guided me back up the stairwell. The resonance followed us, its deafening roar receding only slightly as we climbed higher, the steps groaning under our weight. When we reached the main level of the asylum, the silence was overwhelming. I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving, my mind racing. Victor stood beside me, his expression grim but composed. He glanced back toward the stairwell, his sharp gaze lingering. "They opened something," he said quietly, his voice heavy with meaning. "And now it's awake." The asylum's corridors seemed more oppressive as we retreated from the depths, the air thicker, the whispers now louder and unrelenting. I struggled to steady my breath as Victor and I emerged back into the main level of the asylum. The lantern light swayed, casting distorted shadows against the walls, but it did little to pierce the suffocating darkness that had settled around us. The resonance still lingered, muted but present, a reminder that the entity below was not confined to its chamber. Victor's jaw was set, his movements brisk but controlled as he scanned the hallway for signs of further disturbances. I stayed close, my hands trembling despite my efforts to keep the lantern steady. "What now?" I asked, my voice strained. Victor turned his sharp gaze to me, his expression unreadable. "We find out what it wants." A chill ran down my spine at his words. He spoke as if the thing we had awakened was sentient, as if it had desires, motivations. The thought unsettled me more than the shadows pressing against us. We moved cautiously through the asylum, our footsteps echoing faintly. The building seemed alive now, its walls breathing, the decay whispering secrets we couldn't understand. The distant hum that had followed us earlier began to rise again, faint but insistent, a steady rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with our movements. Victor stopped suddenly, raising his lantern to illuminate a door at the end of the hallway. It was unremarkable at first glance, its wooden surface chipped and worn like the others we had passed. But there was something about it, an aura of foreboding that made my stomach churn. "This wasn't here before," Victor muttered, his voice low. I frowned, my eyes narrowing as I studied the door. He was right, we had passed this hallway earlier, and I was certain it had been empty. How is that possible? I whispered. Victor didn't answer. Instead, he moved closer, his movements deliberate as he reached for the rusted handle. The door creaked open, revealing a room that defied logic. It was pristine, untouched by time, the walls unmarked, the floors gleaming, the furniture intact. A single table stood at the center, its surface covered in objects that seemed to shimmer faintly under the lantern's light. Victor stepped inside, his lantern held high as he approached the table. I hesitated, lingering at the doorway, my instinct screaming at me not to follow. But the pull of the room was too strong, the strange allure of its impossible existence drawing me forward despite my fear. The objects on the table were unlike anything I had ever seen, artifacts of unknown origin, their shapes unfamiliar, their materials foreign. Victor reached for one, his gloved fingers brushing against its surface. The resonance surged immediately, the room filling with an audible hum that sent shivers down my spine. "It's responding," Victor said quietly, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. "These artifacts, they're tied to the entity." "Tied how?" I asked, though my voice trembled. Victor placed the artifact back on the table, his gaze shifting to the other objects. "Anchors," he murmured. "Pieces of it. Fragments left behind when it was summoned." The hum grew louder still, the resonance filling the room, pressing against us like a tangible force. The artifacts began to glow faintly, their shapes shifting subtly under the lantern's light. Victor moved quickly, his notebook in hand as he sketched their forms, his sharp gaze darting between the objects and his notes. I stood frozen, my chest tight, my mind racing. The walls of the room seemed to ripple, the pristine surfaces distorting as though reality itself were unraveling. The resonance reached a fever pitch, and suddenly, the room fell silent. Victor looked up sharply, his lantern casting long shadows across the walls. The glow of the artifacts had faded, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt more suffocating than the noise. And then, from the farthest corner of the room, a figure began to emerge. It wasn't the masked figure we had seen before, it was something else entirely, something formless yet defined, its shape shifting like smoke caught in a beam of light. It moved slowly, deliberately, its presence filling the room with a suffocating weight that made my knees tremble. Victor didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering as the figure approached. "You were bound here," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the palpable tension in the air. "Why?" The figure stopped, its shifting form stabilizing just slightly. When it spoke, its voice was layered, fractured, a chorus of whispers intertwined. "We were made," it said, the words carrying an unnatural resonance that reverberated through my chest, "by hands that sought the unthinkable." Victor narrowed his eyes, his notebook held tightly in his grasp. "Made for what purpose?" "To bridge the divide," the figure replied, its voice growing louder. "To become the conduit." The air in the room grew colder, the shadows pressing closer. I struggled to breathe, my lungs burning as the weight of the figure's presence bore down on me. Victor stood firm, his expression grim. "And now?" he asked. "What do you want now?" The figure shifted again, its form dissolving slightly before reforming. "Release," it said simply. "But the cost is high." Victor's jaw tightened, his sharp gaze darting toward the artifacts on the table. "The anchors," he muttered. "Destroying them would sever your connection." "But at what price?" I asked, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond directly. Instead, it dissolved completely, its presence retreating as the resonance surged once more, filling the room with its deafening roar. Victor moved quickly, his hand reaching for the artifact nearest to him. "Lucien," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Help me!" I stumbled forward, my heart hammering as I reached for another artifact. The resonance grew unbearable, the walls of the room trembling violently, the distortion spreading like cracks in glass. As I gripped the artifact, its glow intensified, its surface burning against my skin despite the fabric of my gloves. Victor slammed the artifact he held against the table, the force shattering it into fragments. The resonance faltered, the room shuddering as the glow faded slightly. I followed suit, smashing the artifact in my grasp against the table's edge, its pieces scattering across the floor. One by one, we destroyed the anchors, the resonance dimming with each shatter. The room seemed to collapse inward, the pristine surfaces warping, the impossible reality unraveling. The final artifact fell, its glow extinguished, and the resonance stopped completely. The silence that followed was overwhelming, suffocating. The room was dark now, the lantern's flame barely providing enough light to illuminate our faces. Victor stood beside me, his breath heavy, his expression grim. "It's severed," he said quietly. "For now." I exhaled shakily, my chest tight, my mind racing. The weight of what we had done, of what we had faced, settled heavily over me. Victor turned to me, his sharp gaze piercing through the darkness. "But it's not over." The silence inside the asylum was almost unbearable, a suffocating void that pressed against us like the aftermath of a roaring storm. Victor's lantern flickered weakly, its light struggling to push back the encroaching darkness that seemed heavier now than ever. The destroyed fragments of the artifacts lay scattered across the room, their glow extinguished, but their presence lingering like ghosts. Victor stood rigid, his eyes fixed on the doorway that led us back to the asylum's main hall. The atmosphere had changed, it was hard to put into words, but the air felt different, charged, as though the entity's severed connection had left behind a wound in reality itself. My legs felt unsteady, each step toward the exit demanding a concentrated effort. "You said it severed," I muttered, my voice breaking the oppressive quiet. "Then why doesn't it feel over?" Victor didn't respond right away. His jaw was set, his sharp gaze narrowing as he scanned the shadows ahead. "Because it's not over, Lucien," he said finally. "Severing the anchors doesn't destroy what they were tied to. It only weakens the connection." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. His words offered little comfort, and I wondered briefly if we had accomplished anything at all by destroying the artifacts. The resonance, though diminished, still lingered faintly in the air, a distant hum that seemed to echo somewhere deep in the building's foundations. Victor moved forward, his steps deliberate yet cautious, his lantern casting restless beams of light across the cracked walls. I followed closely, gripping the broken remnants of my own lantern tightly in my hand. The corridors twisted and stretched unnaturally, their layout no longer resembling the asylum we had entered. Each turn brought new distortions, the walls warping slightly, the doorways shifting positions, the shadows growing darker. The whispers returned, their presence faint but insistent, filling the air with disjointed voices. Their cadence was different now, less frantic and more deliberate, as though they were testing us, watching for our response. I tried to focus on the sound of Victor's footsteps, a steady rhythm that provided some measure of comfort amidst the chaos. "Victor," I said hesitantly, my voice trembling. "Do you think it's watching us?" He didn't pause, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "No, Lucien," he replied, his tone cold. "It's waiting for us." I wasn't sure which answer would have been worse. We entered the main hall, the remnants of the asylum's previous life visible beneath the decay. Old furniture lay scattered across the floor, its warped surfaces gleaming faintly under the lantern's light. The broken frames of faded paintings hung precariously on the walls, their images unrecognizable but disturbingly evocative of faces twisted in anguish. The resonance seemed louder here, vibrating softly against my chest like an erratic heartbeat. Victor stopped near the center of the room, his sharp gaze scanning every inch of the space. He crouched suddenly, his gloved hand brushing against the floor. "Look at this," he said, his voice low. I moved closer, squinting against the lantern's light. The tiles beneath us bore faint traces of carvings, symbols similar to those we had seen earlier, but fragmented, their lines disrupted by deep cracks in the floor. Victor traced one of the patterns carefully, his movements precise. "These symbols, they're pathways." "Pathways?" I echoed, the word foreign and unsettling. Victor stood, brushing off his gloves. "They're meant to guide energy, to channel it toward the anchors." "But the anchors are gone now," I said, my voice shaking. "What happens to the energy?" Victor's gaze shifted to the far end of the room, where the walls seemed darker, heavier, the air colder. "It finds a new focal point," he replied grimly. "A new anchor." My stomach churned at the implications of his words. "And how do we stop it?" Victor's jaw tightened, his expression hardening. "We find it before it manifests fully." The weight of his statement hung heavily between us. I tightened my grip on the broken lantern, my pulse hammering against my ribs as I followed Victor toward the darker end of the room. The resonance grew louder with each step, its vibration digging into my chest like a relentless pulse. The whispers grew clearer now, their voices intertwined, speaking in a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. Victor stopped suddenly, his movements sharp as he raised the lantern higher. "There," he said, his tone clipped. I followed his gaze to the farthest corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to writhe and twist unnaturally. At first, I thought it was another distortion, similar to what we had seen before. But as the shadows shifted and separated, I realized it was something far more tangible, something alive. A figure stood there, emerging slowly from the darkness. It wasn't the masked figure we had encountered earlier, nor the formless presence we had felt in the chamber below. It was human, or at least it seemed human. Its movements were slow, deliberate, its face obscured by the shadows that clung to it like smoke. Victor stepped forward, his lantern's light revealing more of the figure's details. Its clothes were tattered, hanging loosely off its frail frame, its skin pale and translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly green hue that mirrored the engravings on the artifacts we had destroyed. "You're the anchor," Victor said, his tone steady but cold. "A living conduit." The figure tilted its head slightly, its movements unnervingly slow. When it spoke, its voice was layered, fractured, a chorus of whispers intertwined. "I am what they made," it said, its tone chillingly calm. "What they promised." Victor didn't flinch, his sharp gaze fixed on the figure. "The anchors are destroyed. The connection is severed. What do you want now?" The figure's glowing eyes shifted toward me, its gaze piercing despite its otherworldly appearance. "Release," it said simply. "But the cost is high." Victor stepped forward, his movements controlled but unyielding. "Release comes through severing the connection entirely," he said. "But that requires your destruction." The figure's head tilted further, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You cannot destroy me," it said, its voice rising slightly. You cannot destroy what has been made eternal. Victor's jaw tightened, his expression hardening. He glanced toward me briefly, his sharp gaze calculating. "Lucien," he said firmly. "Follow my lead." Before I could respond, Victor raised his lantern high, its flame flaring brighter as he hurled it toward the figure. The glass shattered, the oil spilling across the floor and igniting the shadows in a blaze of light and heat. The figure writhed violently, its movements frantic, its voice rising in a deafening chorus of overlapping whispers. The resonance surged, filling the room with its oppressive vibration. The walls trembled, cracks spidering outward as the building itself seemed to groan in protest. Victor grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit as the flames consumed the figure entirely. The whispers faded, the resonance diminished, but the weight of what had occurred lingered heavily. As we stepped out into the cold night air, the asylum's silhouette loomed behind us, its presence a haunting reminder of the darkness we had confronted. Victor turned to me, his expression grim but composed. "It's severed," he said quietly. "But not destroyed." I nodded numbly, the chill biting at my skin as I stared back at the building. The shadows inside felt heavier now, their presence unyielding despite the flames. The cost of release, it seemed, was far greater than we could have imagined. The cold night air wrapped around us as we stood outside the asylum, its jagged silhouette looming like a malignant presence against the darkened sky. My breath hung in the air, the weight of what had just transpired inside pressing heavily on my chest. The flames had extinguished the figure, the resonance had faded, and yet the oppressive feeling remained, a shadow that stretched beyond the boundaries of the building, reaching into the world beyond. Victor stood beside me, silent, his features carved in stone. He held his notebook in one hand, the pages marked with scribbled notes that now felt inadequate against the enormity of what we had just faced. The lantern in his other hand flickered weakly, the light barely illuminating the cracked pavement at our feet. "We did what we could," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor turned to me, his sharp gaze cutting through the gloom. "We severed the connection, but it wasn't enough." His voice was steady, but I could hear the tension beneath it, the weight of failure that he rarely allowed himself to feel. "The entity was bound here, Lucien. Now, without the anchors, it's free." Free. The word echoed in my mind like a tolling bell. I looked back at the asylum, its darkened windows staring back like hollow eyes. The idea that something born of desperation and ritual, of twisted science and occult ambition, was now unbound, it was too much to comprehend. Victor's expression hardened as he pocketed his notebook. "This isn't over," he said, his tone laced with grim determination. "The entity will seek another anchor, another place to manifest. If we don't contain it." "We will," I interrupted, though the conviction in my words faltered under the weight of my fear. "We have to." Victor nodded, his gaze fixed on the asylum as though memorizing every detail of its broken facade. Then, without another word, he began walking back toward the car, his steps purposeful but heavy, the lantern's weak light guiding the way. I hesitated, casting one last glance at the asylum before following him, the unease in my chest refusing to subside. The drive back to the hotel was silent, the roar of the engine a poor distraction from the thoughts that gnawed at my mind. Victor stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the wheel with a tension that matched the atmosphere. I found myself glancing at the side mirror more often than I cared to admit, half expecting to see some formless shape lingering in the shadows behind us. When we reached the hotel, the sense of unease deepened. The small town of Ravenmoor had an almost unnatural stillness to it, as though the weight of the asylum's presence had spread, casting its shadow over the entire area. Victor parked the car and climbed out without a word, his movements quick and precise as he gathered his belongings. I followed him into the lobby, the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath our feet a sharp contrast to the oppressive silence that surrounded us. In the privacy of his room, Victor laid out his notes on the small desk, his lantern casting a flickering light over the hastily drawn diagrams and symbols. He worked quickly, his pencil flying across the page as he connected fragmented pieces of information, his sharp mind piecing together a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. I stood by the window, staring out at the darkened street below. The weight of the night's events bore down on me, the whispers and shadows still fresh in my mind. "Do you think it's gone?" I asked quietly, my voice breaking the silence. Victor didn't look up from his work. "Not gone," he said. "Weakened. Bound to this place, perhaps. But it will find a way to resurface." The thought sent a shiver through me, and I turned away from the window. And what then? How do we stop something that isn't human? Victor finally looked up, his gaze piercing. "We don't stop it," he said. "We contain it. We find the next anchor before it manifests fully. We sever the connection again if we must." His words were resolute, but I could see the strain in his eyes, the weight of the decisions we had yet to make. "And if we can't?" I asked, the question hanging heavily in the air. Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Hours later, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, we stood on the edge of town, looking back at the distant silhouette of the asylum. The building seemed smaller in the daylight, its ominous presence diminished by the golden hues of the rising sun. But I knew better. The shadows that had haunted its halls weren't gone, they were simply hiding, waiting. Victor lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face before the smoke curled into the crisp morning air. He took a long drag, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice low. I nodded, the weight of his words settling heavily on my shoulders. "And where do we go from here?" Victor exhaled slowly, the smoke dissipating into the lightening sky. "Wherever the next case takes us." His words were simple, but they carried a gravity that I couldn't ignore. The asylum, the entity, the anchors, they were all part of something larger, something we had only just begun to uncover. And as much as I feared what lay ahead, I knew I couldn't turn back now. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the town of Ravenmoor. The asylum silhouette remained etched against the horizon, a haunting reminder of the darkness we had faced, and the darkness still to come. As Victor flicked his cigarette into the dirt, he turned to me, his expression resolute. "Let's get moving," he said. I followed him to the car, my steps heavy but determined. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers we couldn't yet comprehend. But as long as Victor Graves was leading the way, I knew we had a chance. The engine roared to life, and we drove away from Ravenmoor, the shadows of the asylum fading into the distance. But in my mind, they would never truly disappear. They were part of the story now, part of the case, the beginning of something far greater than either of us could have imagined. The twisted case files of Victor Graves had only just begun. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through phantom lights of Ravenmoor Asylum. The shadows may have retreated, but their whispers will always linger. If you enjoyed unraveling this eerie tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Twisted Case Files for more mysteries and supernatural adventures. Until next time, stay curious, and see you in the next story.